The hedgerows of Normandy swallowed sound. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves could mean death. Sergeant William "Red" Patterson crouched behind the smoldering hull of what had been Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes as he watched the tree line 600 yards ahead. Somewhere in that green hell, a Panther waited. He knew it was there because 3 minutes ago it had put a 75-millimeter round clean through Morrison's frontal armor like a knife through wet cardboard. The shell had entered just below the driver's viewport and exited through the engine compartment, leaving nothing but fire and screaming in its wake. If you're watching this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story needs to be told. Patterson's hands trembled as he gripped the loader's hatch of his own Sherman, the M4A3E8 they called Easy 8. But easy was the last word anyone would use to describe what they faced. The Panther's 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor might as well have been a fortress wall. Standard American 75-millimeter ammunition bounced off like pebbles thrown at a castle gate. The crews knew it. The Germans knew it. And somewhere in that tree line, a Panther commander was probably laughing. But Patterson had something different in his ammunition rack, something the Army had been whispering about for months. A black-tipped round that weighed less than standard ammunition, but carried a secret inside its core. Tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances known to man, machined into a penetrating rod and wrapped in a lightweight aluminum body. The designation was simple: HVAP, High Velocity Armor Piercing. The nickname was simpler still. The tankers called it Black Magic. The story of how that round came to be sitting in Patterson's ammunition rack is a story of desperation, innovation, and the brutal mathematics of armored warfare. It begins not in the hedgerows of Normandy, but in the testing grounds of Aberdeen, Maryland, where American engineers first confronted an uncomfortable truth. Their tanks were death traps, and their ammunition was worthless against the new generation of German armor. The American M4 Sherman was never designed to fight tanks. That simple fact, often forgotten in the mythology of World War II, explains almost everything that went wrong in the summer of 1944. The Sherman was conceived as an infantry support vehicle, a mobile artillery platform, meant to exploit breakthroughs and support ground troops. Its 75-millimeter gun was adequate for destroying bunkers, machine gun nests, and the lighter tanks of the early war period. Against a Panzer III or Panzer IV, the Sherman could hold its own, but the Panther was something else entirely. The Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther represented Germany's answer to the T-34, the Soviet medium tank that had shocked Wehrmacht commanders during Operation Barbarossa. German engineers studied captured T-34s with obsessive attention, noting the sloped armor that caused shells to ricochet harmlessly away, the wide tracks that distributed weight across soft ground, the powerful gun that could engage targets at ranges German tanks couldn't match. The result of their study rolled off production lines in January 1943, a 45-ton monster with a 75-millimeter high-velocity gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The frontal glacis plate of the Panther was 80 millimeters thick, angled at 55 degrees from vertical. That angle was the key to everything. When a shell struck angled armor, it had to penetrate not just the actual thickness of the steel, but the effective thickness created by the angle. An 80-millimeter plate at 55 degrees presented an effective thickness of nearly 140 millimeters to an incoming round. Standard American 75-millimeter ammunition, even the armor-piercing variety, could penetrate approximately 70 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. American tankers were bringing knives to a gunfight. The situation in Normandy became critical almost immediately after D-Day. American armored units pushing inland from the beaches encountered Panthers for the first time in significant numbers during the battles around Villers-Bocage and Caen. The results were catastrophic. Sherman after Sherman brewed up, the tankers' grim slang for the explosive fires that consumed their vehicles when ammunition cooked off. Crews learned to identify the distinctive silhouette of the Panther, with its wide tracks and sloped turret, and to feel the cold hand of fear grip their hearts whenever they saw it. The disparity in capability created tactical nightmares. American doctrine called for tanks to engage at ranges between 500 and 800 yards, close enough for accurate fire, but far enough to allow maneuver. Against Panthers, those ranges were suicide. The German 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at over 2,000 yards. The Panther could sit hull down behind a hedgerow, expose only its heavily armored turret, and pick off advancing Shermans one by one while remaining essentially invulnerable to return fire. American tank destroyers, designed specifically for anti-armor work, fared little better. Their guns were more powerful, but their open-top turrets and thin armor made them vulnerable to artillery and infantry attack. Reports flooded back to the Ordnance Department in Washington. Tank commanders described shells bouncing off Panther armor at point-blank range. Gunners reported hitting German tanks multiple times with no visible effect. The morale of armored units began to crack under the strain of fighting an enemy they couldn't hurt. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. The solution had actually been in development since 1942, but bureaucratic inertia and material shortages had delayed its deployment. The concept was elegantly simple. Standard armor-piercing ammunition relied on mass and velocity to punch through steel. A heavy shell propelled at high speed would use its kinetic energy to physically displace the armor in its path. But there was a limit to how much velocity conventional propellants could generate, and there was a limit to how much mass could be accelerated before the shell became too heavy to achieve adequate speed. The breakthrough came from understanding that penetration wasn't just about energy, it was about energy concentration. A smaller, denser projectile focusing its energy on a smaller point could achieve penetration that a larger, heavier shell could not. Tungsten carbide, with a density nearly twice that of steel, offered the perfect solution. A tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body could be accelerated to velocities far exceeding those of conventional ammunition. When it struck armor, the aluminum would shatter away, leaving the dense tungsten core to concentrate all its energy on a tiny point of impact. The physics were revolutionary. Standard armor-piercing ammunition for the American 75mm gun achieved muzzle velocities around 2,800 feet per second. The new HVAP round screamed out of the barrel at 3,400 feet per second, over 600 feet per second faster. That additional velocity translated directly into penetrating power. At 500 yards, the HVAP round could defeat over 130 millimeters of armor, nearly double the performance of standard ammunition. For the first time, American tankers had a weapon that could threaten the Panther's frontal armor. But tungsten was rare. The metal came primarily from mines in Portugal, Spain, and China, and global demand far exceeded supply. Aircraft manufacturing consumed enormous quantities for cutting tools and electrical contacts. The Manhattan Project had classified requirements that took priority over everything else. What little remained for ammunition production had to be carefully rationed. When HVAP rounds finally reached frontline units in the autumn of 1944, each tank received only a handful. Commanders issued strict orders. HVAP was to be used only against the most dangerous targets, only when no other option existed, only when a kill was virtually certain. Let me tell you about October 29, 1944, near the ancient fortress city of Metz in eastern France. Staff Sergeant James Cooper commanded an M4A3E8 Sherman in the 3rd Armored Division, part of the massive American force pushing toward the German border. His crew had been fighting for 3 months, an eternity in armored warfare. They had lost friends, watched fellow tankers burn, learned the hard lessons of combat against an enemy with superior equipment. Cooper carried 3 HVAP rounds in his ammunition rack. He had never fired one. The morning began with fog, thick and gray, filling the valleys and hollows of the French countryside. Cooper's platoon was tasked with clearing a road junction that intelligence reported was defended by scattered German infantry. No armor was expected. But intelligence in combat is always a guess, and guesses are often wrong. The first sign of trouble came at 1600 hours. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a landscape of stubbled fields and skeletal trees, stripped of leaves by the autumn wind. Cooper's Sherman was second in the column, following Lieutenant Harrison's vehicle along a narrow lane bordered by drainage ditches. The lead tank rounded a bend and stopped. Harrison's voice crackled over the radio, calm but tense. Panther, 400 yards, hauled down behind a stone wall. Cooper felt his stomach clench. 400 yards was point-blank range for tank combat, close enough that even the most inexperienced gunner couldn't miss. At that distance, the Panther's gun would punch through Sherman armor like a fist through paper. Harrison was already a dead man. He just didn't know it yet. The German commander knew his business. The Panther's gun spoke once, a flat crack that echoed across the fields. Harrison's Sherman lurched backward, smoke pouring from the driver's compartment. Cooper saw the crew bailing out, Harrison dragging his wounded driver through the commander's hatch, flames licking at their uniforms. The Panther's turret was already traversing, searching for its next victim. Standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal. A single Panther in a prepared position could destroy an entire platoon of Shermans if they were foolish enough to engage frontally. Cooper should have ordered his driver to reverse, should have called for artillery support, should have done anything other than what he actually did. He ordered his gunner to load HVAP. The black-tipped round slid into the breech with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Cooper pressed his eye to the gunner's periscope, centering the reticle on the Panther's turret face. The range was short enough that trajectory compensation was minimal. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the German gunner finished traversing and put a round through Cooper's own tank. The Sherman's gun fired. What happened next defied everything the Germans believed about armored warfare. The HVAP round, traveling at over 3,000 feet per second, struck the Panther's turret face just below the gun mantlet. The tungsten core, harder than the armor it struck, didn't shatter or deform. Instead, it punched through the 80 millimeters of case-hardened steel with almost contemptuous ease. The side armor, 40 millimeters of the finest German engineering, simply gave way. Not shattered, not cracked. The metal opened like warm butter beneath a hot knife, cut through with surgical precision that defied every law of armored combat the Wehrmacht had written into doctrine. Inside the Panther, physics transformed into horror. The tungsten penetrator, still carrying enormous kinetic energy, fragmented upon entering the crew compartment. Superheated metal fragments sprayed across the interior, igniting ammunition, fuel, and flesh with equal indifference. The Panther's turret hatches blew open as internal pressure sought escape. A column of flame erupted from the commander's cupola, rising 30 feet into the autumn sky. Cooper sat frozen, unable to process what he had just witnessed. For months, he had watched Panthers shrug off everything American tanks could throw at them. He had seen shells bounce off their armor, had seen rounds shatter against their glacis plates, had attended too many memorial services for men killed by enemies they couldn't hurt. And now, with a single shot, he had killed a Panther. The beast that haunted his nightmares was burning in front of him. Word of the engagement spread through American armored units with the speed of wildfire. The new ammunition worked. The Panthers could be killed. Within weeks, HVA rounds had acquired an almost mystical reputation. Tankers traded stories about the black-tipped shells that melted German armor like wax, that passed through steel as if it weren't there, that turned invincible Panthers into burning coffins. The nickname Black Magic appeared in after-action reports, in letters home, in the dark humor of men who faced death every day. But the German tankers had their own name for it. Survivors of HVAP strikes, the few who managed to bail out before their vehicles were consumed by fire, reported to their commanders with shaking hands and haunted eyes. They described shells that penetrated where penetration should have been impossible, that defeated armor that had stopped everything else. Some called it hexenwork, witchcraft. Others simply refused to discuss it, as if speaking the words might summon the curse upon themselves. The psychological impact of HVAP extended far beyond its actual effectiveness. German Panther crews, accustomed to near invulnerability when fighting American tanks, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The confidence that came from superior armor, the certainty that enemy shells would bounce harmlessly away, evaporated. Every engagement now carried the risk of instant death, with no warning and no defense. Panther commanders became more cautious, more likely to withdraw rather than stand and fight, more hesitant to expose their vehicles to American guns. This psychological warfare was perhaps more valuable than the ammunition's physical capabilities. HVAP remained scarce throughout the war. Most Sherman crews never received more than a handful of rounds, and many never received any at all. But the Germans didn't know that. They knew only that American tanks now possessed a weapon that could kill Panthers at combat ranges, and that knowledge alone was enough to change the dynamic of armored warfare on the Western Front. Take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates military history. Your support keeps these stories alive. The technical specifications of the HVAP round reveal the engineering brilliance behind its design. The T4 HVAP cartridge for the American 76mm gun weighed approximately 12 pounds, significantly less than the 17-pound standard armor-piercing round. This weight reduction came from the aluminum body surrounding the tungsten core, which added volume without adding mass. The lighter weight allowed the propellant charge to accelerate the round to higher velocities, while the tungsten core provided the density necessary for penetration. The tungsten carbide penetrator itself was a marvel of precision machining. Tungsten carbide is extraordinarily hard but also brittle, requiring careful manufacturing to prevent cracking during the enormous accelerations of firing. American engineers developed specialized techniques for shaping and finishing the penetrators, ensuring consistent quality across production runs. Each penetrator was essentially a precision instrument, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The physics of penetration were complex and counterintuitive. When a conventional armor-piercing shell struck armor, it deformed on impact, spreading its energy across a wider area. This deformation reduced penetration, but increased the chance of creating spalling, secondary fragments that could cause damage even if the shell itself didn't fully penetrate. HVAP rounds worked differently. The tungsten core was so hard that it didn't deform significantly on impact. Instead, it cut through the armor in a process called adiabatic shear, essentially drilling through the steel at such speed that the metal around the penetrator had no time to respond. The result was a narrow, clean penetration hole rather than the wider crater left by conventional rounds. This had tactical implications. HVAP rounds were more likely to achieve full penetration, but less likely to cause extensive spalling if they failed to penetrate. Against thinner armor, standard ammunition might actually be more effective because it created more secondary damage. The optimal use of HVAP was against heavily armored targets where conventional rounds had no chance of penetrating. The scarcity of tungsten created constant tension between frontline demands and supply limitations. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army in its drive across France, repeatedly demanded larger allocations of HVAP ammunition for his armored divisions. Patton understood better than most the psychological importance of giving his tankers weapons that could hurt the enemy. A confident tank crew fought differently than one that felt outgunned and outmatched. But the Ordnance Department faced impossible choices. Every tungsten penetrator diverted to tank ammunition was a penetrator not available for machine tool production, for armor-piercing aircraft ammunition, for the countless other military applications that demanded the rare metal. Production quotas were set and adjusted, priorities shifted, allocations debated in endless meetings while men died in Normandy hedgerows and Ardennes forests. The British faced similar challenges with their own high-velocity ammunition. The armor-piercing discarding sabot round, or APDS, used a different approach to achieve similar results. Rather than wrapping a tungsten core in aluminum, the British design surrounded a dense tungsten penetrator with a full-caliber sabot, a sleeve that fell away after the round left the barrel. The sabot allowed the gun to fire a sub-caliber projectile at extremely high velocities while maintaining barrel compatibility with standard ammunition. British APDS rounds achieved even higher velocities than American HVAP, with some variants exceeding 4,000 feet per second. But they also suffered from accuracy problems at longer ranges, as the discarding sabot sometimes interfered with the projectile's flight path. American tankers who received British ammunition reported mixed results, praising its penetration but complaining about its tendency to miss at distances beyond 500 yards. The cat-and-mouse game between armor and ammunition reached its peak during the final year of the war. German engineers, aware that their Panthers were no longer invulnerable, began exploring ways to defeat the new Allied ammunition. Scherzen, the side skirts originally designed to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles, provided some protection by detonating HVAP rounds prematurely. Zimmerit paste, applied to tank exteriors to prevent magnetic mines from adhering, had no effect on kinetic penetrators, but added weight that German industry could ill afford. Some German units experimented with additional armor plates welded or bolted to vulnerable areas. These improvised upgrades, called Zusatzpanzerung, could add 10 to 20 millimeters of protection to turret faces and hull sides. But they also added weight, straining transmissions already prone to failure and reducing the Panther's already limited operational range. The law of diminishing returns applied brutally to armored vehicle design. Each additional ton of protection meant reduced mobility, increased mechanical failures, and greater strain on Germany's collapsing logistics network. The psychological dimension of armored warfare in 1944 and 45 is often overlooked in technical analyses. Men fought inside these machines, not computers or automatons. They experienced fear, courage, despair, and hope. They formed bonds with their crewmates that transcended normal friendship, knowing that survival depended on every man doing his job perfectly under conditions of unimaginable stress. The introduction of HVAP ammunition changed the emotional landscape of tank combat as much as it changed the tactical landscape. American tankers who received HVAP allocations described feeling a weight lift from their shoulders. For the first time since encountering Panthers, they had a fighting chance. The knowledge that their gun could hurt the enemy, that German armor was not invincible, transformed their approach to combat. They maneuvered more aggressively, engaged at ranges they would previously have avoided, took risks that would have been suicidal with standard ammunition. German Panther crews experienced the opposite transformation. The certainty that had characterized their early encounters with American armor evaporated. Veterans who had grown accustomed to engaging Shermans with contemptuous ease now hesitated, wondering if this particular Sherman carried the deadly black-tipped rounds. Hesitation in tank combat was often fatal. A commander who paused to assess whether his enemy might be armed with HVAP gave that enemy precious seconds to fire first. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter offensive of December 1944, provided the ultimate test of HVAP's combat effectiveness. German armored forces, spearheaded by Panther and King Tiger tanks, smashed through American lines in the Ardennes, seeking to reach the vital port of Antwerp and split the Allied armies. American tank destroyers and Sherman crews faced waves of German armor in some of the most intense fighting of the war. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, surrounded by German forces and cut off from resupply, American tankers husbanded their HVAP rounds like precious gems. Each black-tipped shell represented potential survival, the ability to kill a German tank that might otherwise kill them. Ammunition discipline became paramount. Gunners learned to identify the exact moment when an HVAP shot was justified, waiting for the perfect opportunity, rather than wasting irreplaceable rounds on uncertain shots. The defense of the twin villages of Rocherath-Krinkelt in the northern shoulder of the Bulge demonstrated both the power and limitations of American armored doctrine. Tank destroyers and Sherman tanks fought desperate engagements against German Panthers and King Tigers, often at ranges measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. HVAP rounds proved their worth, penetrating armor that standard ammunition couldn't touch, turning the tide of individual engagements and buying time for infantry to withdraw or reinforcements to arrive. But no amount of ammunition could overcome the fundamental disparity in numbers. The Germans attacked with far more tanks than the Americans could field in defense, and even HVAP couldn't kill targets faster than they appeared. Individual heroism and superior ammunition allowed American units to exact a terrible toll on German armor, but the sheer weight of the offensive threatened to overwhelm defensive positions regardless. The weather played its own role in the drama, heavy overcast and snow-grounded Allied aircraft denying the decisive advantage of air superiority that had characterized operations since D-Day. Without P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoon swooping down with rockets and bombs, German tanks could maneuver relatively freely, concentrating for attacks without fear of aerial interdiction. The ground forces had to fight alone, relying on their weapons and their courage to hold the line. When the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, the transformation was dramatic. Fighter bombers resumed their deadly work, turning German armored columns into burning scrapyards. But the tankers who had held during the dark days took particular pride in their accomplishment. They had proven that American crews with the right ammunition could stand against the best German armor and win. The legend of Black Magic had earned its place in the annals of armored warfare. The story of HVAP extended beyond the Western Front. In the Pacific Theater, where Japanese tanks were generally lighter and less well-armored than their German counterparts, HVAP was rarely needed. Standard ammunition could defeat virtually all Japanese armor at normal combat ranges. But a few rounds found their way into theater stockpiles, used occasionally against fortified positions where extreme penetration was required. The Soviet Union, fighting the vast majority of German Panther and Tiger production on the Eastern Front, developed its own solutions to the heavy armor problem. Soviet engineers focused on larger caliber guns rather than specialized ammunition, fielding the 122mm D-25T gun on the IS-2 heavy tank. This massive weapon relied on sheer kinetic energy to defeat armor, throwing a 25-kilogram shell at velocities that could penetrate virtually any German tank at combat ranges. The Soviets also developed their own tungsten core ammunition, designated BR-471B, for use against the most heavily armored targets. Like American HVAP, Soviet tungsten rounds were scarce and carefully allocated. The global shortage of tungsten affected all combatants equally, forcing each nation to balance the competing demands of military necessity and industrial reality. The legacy of HVAP and similar high-velocity subcaliber ammunition extends far beyond World War II. Modern armored vehicles face threats from anti-tank missiles, guided munitions, and sophisticated penetrating rounds that trace their ancestry directly to the black-tipped shells that terrorized Panther crews in Normandy. The fundamental physics remain the same: concentrate energy on a small point to achieve penetration that distributed force cannot accomplish. Contemporary armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, the standard anti-tank ammunition for modern main battle tanks, are direct descendants of World War II HVAP and APDS technology. These rounds use depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators launched at velocities exceeding 5,000 feet per second to defeat modern composite and reactive armor. The engineering has advanced enormously, but the core concept remains unchanged. A dense, hard penetrator moving at extreme velocity can defeat armor that resists conventional attacks. The human cost of the armored battles in Normandy and beyond should never be forgotten. Thousands of American tankers died in their Shermans, incinerated by German shells that penetrated armor designed to protect them. Many more were wounded, carrying burns and scars for the rest of their lives. The men who crewed Panther tanks suffered similarly, caught in machines that became coffins when HVAP or aircraft rockets found their mark. Staff Sergeant James Cooper, whose shot near Metz entered the folklore of American armored forces, survived the war. He returned to his home in Ohio, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a mechanic until his retirement. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, and when he did, he never described the burning Panther or the screams of German crewmen trapped inside. Some memories were too heavy to carry into civilian life. The development of HVAP represents a broader pattern in military technology, the constant race between offensive and defensive capabilities. Armor improvements prompt the development of more powerful weapons, which in turn drive the creation of better armor. This cycle continues today, with tank designers incorporating composite materials, reactive armor, and active protection systems to defeat threats that World War II engineers could barely imagine. But the fundamental lesson of the Sherman-Panther confrontation remains relevant. Superior technology alone doesn't win wars. The Panthers were better tanks than the Shermans by almost every measure: thicker armor, more powerful guns, superior optics. Yet Germany lost the war, overwhelmed by Allied industrial capacity, strategic bombing, and the inexhaustible manpower of the Soviet Union. American factories produced Shermans faster than German guns could destroy them, and American engineers developed solutions like HVAP that neutralized German technological advantages. The story of the shot that melted Panther armor like butter is ultimately a story about adaptation. American forces, faced with an enemy they couldn't defeat with existing equipment, found new ways to fight. They developed new ammunition, new tactics, new techniques for surviving in an environment designed to kill them. They learned from their failures, mourned their dead, and kept fighting until victory was achieved. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want more deep dives into military history. Your support makes these videos possible. The hedgerows of Normandy are quiet now. Farmers plow fields that once ran red with blood, their tractors occasionally turning up shell fragments and equipment buried for 8 decades. Memorial stones mark the places where tanks burned and men died, their inscriptions weathered by time but still readable. Tourists visit the beaches and cemeteries, trying to understand the magnitude of what happened here. But in the earth beneath those fields, rust slowly consumes the remnants of armored warfare. Fragments of Sherman and Panther alike return to oxide, the molecules that once formed engines, and armor plates dispersing into the soil. The tungsten cores of HVAP rounds, too hard to rust, remain essentially unchanged, small cylinders of metal that will outlast everything else from those desperate days. They are monuments of a different kind, these penetrators. Not inscribed with names or dates, not visited by descendants or tourists, just small pieces of metal that once flew at 3,000 feet per second, carrying the hopes and fears of American tankers toward German steel. The shot that melted Panther armor like butter, the black magic that changed the mathematics of armored warfare, reduced now to artifacts scattered across a continent. The men who fired those shots and the men who received them share a strange brotherhood, united by the intimacy of combat at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. They saw each other's vehicles, sometimes saw each other's faces in the moments before fire and death. Some survived to tell their stories, many did not. Their war ended 80 years ago, but its echoes continue in every armored vehicle that rolls off a production line, in every penetrator designed to defeat armor, in every calculation of protection versus threat. That is the legacy of Normandy's armored battles. Not just victory or defeat, not just names and dates, but a fundamental transformation in how wars are fought. The desperation that drove American engineers to develop HVRP, the terror that Panther crews felt when they realized their armor could be penetrated, the relief that washed over Sherman commanders when they finally had a fighting chance. These emotions shaped technology and tactics in ways that persist today. And somewhere in a museum case or a private collection, a black-tipped HVAP round sits in quiet testimony. It looks almost innocuous, this small piece of metal and explosive. Nothing about its appearance suggests the revolutionary physics it contains, the engineering brilliance of its design, the blood it was created to spill. But those who know its history, who understand what it meant to the men who carried it into battle, regard it with something approaching reverence. It was, after all, black magic.